So today's date is July 11th, 2012.
Yes,
My name is Jonathan Kirsch. I'm with the City of Lakewood, KLTV Channel 8, and we were recording this personal history with Carl New for Lakewood and this Jefferson County Public Library Oral History Project. So Carl, let's start off. What is your full name?
Full name is Carl Herbert New, Jr.
Okay, and where were you born?
I was born in Miami Beach, Florida.
What year?
1937.
Okay.
Good year.
What were your parents' names?
My father was Carl Herbert, of course, and my mother was Catherine Mary Miller. Married him, and after I was born in Miami, we moved to Lakewood, Ohio. So I started out in my first Lakewood. Okay.
Where were they originally from?
My father was born in Indianapolis, Indiana, but was raised in Dearborn, Michigan. My mother was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania, raised in Philadelphia.
Okay. And how long have you lived in Lakewood?
Since 1969. In fact, when we moved here, it wasn't even Lakewood. It was Jefferson City, Colorado.
And what area of Lakewood?
We're in the Westgate subdivision, which is in the southern part of the city.
Okay. Are you married?
Yes, I am.
And what's your wife's name? Excuse me.
Her
What's your
name
wife's
is
name?
Carmen Mercedes. Okay.
And where is she from?
She is from Panama.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And what else would you need to know?
When was she born?
She was born in 1938.
Okay. Do you know the names of her parents?
Her parents were J. Bartley Smith and, got to stop and think now, Mercedes Allegre.
And
Okay.
where were they from?
Well, her father was from the United States. He was an engineer for the Panama Canal Company. Her mother was from Panama.
Okay. And do you have brothers or sisters?
No.
Okay. And do you have children?
Yes, two sons. One named Carl Bartley and the other one David Conrad.
And what years were they born?
Carl, known as Bart, was born in 1969 and David in 1971.
Great. Where did you go to? Let's start off with your early age. Where did you go to school?
Well, high school, Brecksville, Ohio, which was south of Cleveland. And then I did my undergraduate studies at MIT and my graduate degree is from Harvard.
And how long was the school year when you were a child?
Actually, it started in September and ended late May. I grew up in a farm community, so it always started after Labor Day so the county fair could be held. And then it got off early May so they could do the planting. I mean, the agricultural sites of the community pretty much determined the school year.
Sure, sure. And you went to MIT. What was your degree in? I'm sorry?
Metallurgy, but I also studied, didn't get a degree, just took other courses, a lot of management and political science classes. And even a class in Elizabethan literature.
And when did you graduate from MIT?
1959.
What was your occupation?
My occupation, well, right now, for many years, management consultant. I've had my own company since 1971. And we deal primarily with organizations that are going through very high levels of change that strategically affect their market. And I'm semi-retired now, but that company started in '71.
Okay. And did you have any other kind of jobs besides the consulting?
Well, yeah, because when I got out of graduate school, I was in the Army for 6 years. And then after that, I worked at MIT for 2 years in the administration of the school. And then later came to Denver and was employed by the Gates Rubber Company in terms of new business, non-rubber related business development, and then left them in 1971 and started my own company.
Gotcha. And you said you're semi-retired. When did that start?
Well, I don't know, probably about 2 years ago. I tell people I have to keep on working because I have to fund everybody else's entitlements, see? So I have an obligation to society.
What's the most interesting job you've had?
I would say probably the one I've had in my own company because it allowed me to work with a large number of organizations over the last 30-some years, gosh, almost 40 years now, that were going through high levels of change. In the 70s, that was the banking industry because we still had a lot of family-owned banks around the United States. And of course now, you know, the consolidation, you can count the number of large banks in the United States on one hand pretty much. And then in the 80s and 90s, it was healthcare and a lot of those types of things and the high-tech companies. But always I've worked with, ever since I was on the Lakewood City Council from '75 to '79, Also kept a part of my business to work with local government officials, and that's where I concentrate all my energy right now, city and counties primarily, and their state associations.
Okay. What were your parents' occupations?
My father was in the meatpacking business and then had his own company for many years. My mother was a nurse, psychiatric nurse, and first a surgical nurse and then later a psychiatric nurse.
What, if anything, do you remember about the Great Depression?
Nothing.
Okay.
Remember a little bit about World War II because I had uncles in it, but the Great Depression was pretty much behind me. Right. Did you know? Well, did you know anyone on relief or in the CCC camps? No,
Did they have
again,
any of those?
because I was just too young to know that. I was born in '37. The Great Depression allegedly ended about 1938 with the advent of World War II starting in Europe, which revived everybody's economies again. So,
Right.
and I don't really have any cognitive memory except probably about from '42 on because of the effects of the war, and I had family members that were affected by World War II.
So what do you remember about World War II?
Well, basically, I had two uncles stationed in the Pacific. I remember the rationing aspect of it because my dad and I remember still helping him stomp tin cans and turning them in, and I remember him talking about the rationing books and all that sort of thing. And I also remember, ironically, the day the war started with Pearl Harbor, because my dad was out fox hunting in the back of our farm, and he was carrying me in his hand, and a neighbor came running over and he said, "They've bombed Pearl Harbor," and he dropped me right into the bunch of raspberry bushes. So I probably was the first casualty of World War II in Hinckley, Ohio, which is where I lived at that time. Yeah.
Sure. What do you remember about how the war affected that community that you lived in?
Basically, the most notable thing I remember were the air raid drills that went on because we had a neighbor who was one of the air raid wardens, this kind of thing. But obviously we had, and then of course in Cleveland, which was north of Hinckley, Ohio, there were tremendous factories turning out tanks, aircraft, and everything else. And we'd drive by those, and my dad would point them out to me, and I still remember those.
It's not something you see a lot these days.
No, that's not sure. Well, most of those plants are gone now, but they were huge tank plants. And right near where our farm was, they had an actual tank proving grounds. And I used to go over and was a child, and my dad would take me there. And we got to know the people that were running the program. So we'd watch them running the tanks up and down through hills and mud puddles and all that kind of stuff.
You said you had a couple of uncles serve? In
Yes,
what
two
branch?
uncles. They were brothers of my sister. My mother, excuse me. And they both served in the Pacific in the United States Army.
Okay, gotcha. In later years, do you remember how the Korean and Vietnamese conflicts
Well, the
affected?
Korean War, I just remember because I was in college at the high school actually at the time, because it was over in '53 and I didn't graduate from high school in '55. The Vietnam War I remember very well because I participated in it. Because I went on active duty in the Army in '61. I'd received my commission through ROTC in '59, but they gave me a 2-year inactive reserve, so I finished my master's. And then I was stationed in Germany and then later transferred to Vietnam. And that was in '66 and '67. Tour of duty there.
And then you came back in '68?
Came out and got out of the Army in '67. I'd finished my 8-year obligation as a reserve officer.
Gotcha. Okay. How did seeing a man walk on the moon affect your family?
Well, it was very interesting because one of the things that made me feel proud of it was the fact that we had the scientific accomplishment that we did. It was a very clearly articulated dream set by President Kennedy, and a dream that came to fruition and made us, I think, feel proud as a society. I also think it was important that it kind of redeemed the shame we felt when Russia sent a Sputnik up. It was about the size of an icebox and about technologically advanced, and they beat the hell out of us in space for a few years.
Do you remember watching it on TV?
What?
The man walking on the moon?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What was going through your mind when you saw that?
Basically what I was just thinking about, and at that time I was now back working at MIT, so a lot of the technology that had gone into the moon activities, particularly the guidance systems and all that, were developed at MIT in its laboratory. So there was a lot of celebration on campus about that success also.
Okay. Excuse me. Let's see. What was your favorite moment in sports?
I don't know. I'm not a big sports fan, professional sports. I basically think there are a lot of overpaid underperformers. But I would say the most exciting one for me is to actually watch my sons and my grandson be very successful in lacrosse. They were both, our sons were both all-state lacrosse players and played in college and so on. And now my older grandson, who's 14, is following in their footsteps. And I find sports of that type where there's real blood, not don't say blood, sweat, and tears, but a sense of enthusiasm about it. I think professional sports, the problem with this is just too much money in the game, not enough. We've ruined a lot of people by making them too rich.
Where'd your sons go to school?
My older son is a graduate of Metro State, or now Metro State University, and which I had the pleasure for 18 years of being on their foundation board, so I'm very attached to that school. My older son has degrees from Tulane University, Auburn, and his law degree from the University of Seattle. Excuse me, he's my younger son. Did I say that? My younger son.
Your younger son. Okay.
Gotta get my sons straight. Yeah, I have to figure out which one's my favorite son on any given day and then give them credit. Okay. I used to play that game with them until they caught on. Okay.
What would you say the greatest achievement mankind has experienced during your lifetime?
Oh, during my lifetime. Okay. I would probably say the end of the Cold War.
Why is that?
Tear down that wall, Mr. Gorbachev. And then I think since then, the prowess of America has been on a steady decline.
In your opinion, what significance did tearing down the wall have?
Well, the thing that was interesting is that it brought about the end of a major threat, again, to the freedom of society without having warfare being the alternative to make that happen. Because the previous efforts were World War I, World War II. And in this particular case, what we did was just outlasted them because you had a first world military nation with a third world economy, and it just financially collapsed. That's exactly what brought down Russia.
and with those tensions, and then
then the Soviet Union later became Russia. Right?
Sure. Those tensions, along with like the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a lot of tension going on in the U.S. that maybe kids today don't know much about. What was it like living under that kind of tension?
Well, I think number one, I mentioned earlier that I have an Army commission because of ROTC. Well, there's a real reason why all of us went through ROTC at MIT. First, it was a land grant school, and we were required to do so. And secondly, we all knew if we didn't, we were going to get drafted anyway because the draft was still around. And so we figured, heck, if we're going to go in anyway, let's go in as an officer. And a large amount of my classes did. But the other thing I think about it was that you lived under that constant sense that there always could be an outbreak of a nuclear war. And the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think, was a classic example of that. I was stationed at that time at Redstone Arsenal, Alabama. And that's the headquarters of the Army Missile Command. And I can't tell you much about it because it was classified, but it got pretty scary there for a while and what our engagement was and what could have happened if we had actually gone to war with Russia over that. But Gorbachev backed down, not Gorbachev, Khrushchev rather, backed down. And we were lucky on that one. But that pall of the threat of war was always hanging over us. And I'm not sure today that today's generation understands the significance of that. And so as a result, I think they've gotten kind of numbed to the types of tyranny that we now see coming out of places like Iran, Syria, still with Russia, with now the advent now of Putin coming back, et cetera. And I think the modern generation just does not appreciate the fact that the concept of what we call freedom and democracy is always in peril. Most of the nations of the world today are tyranny and despotic nations.
Okay. What community groups, fraternal organizations, and churches did you and your parents attend?
Well, I'm kind of a walking ecumenical council. My father was German Lutheran, my mother Irish Catholic, and my wife Episcopalian, and I became a member of all three churches. and I've got the little letters from the bishops proving that. So I tell people I'm a walking ecumenical council. I just walk in. I'm fine. The church and God and I get along just fine. And so I would say right now, more than anything else, my wife and I, we both have a very deep religious sense in our personal lives. But we've lost a lot of our enthusiasm for affiliation with organized religion.
When you said you grew up in a farm community?
Well, the community was a farm community because that's where my parents decided to live. But my dad's business was primarily in the greater Cleveland area.
Okay.
And meat packing, poultry distribution, this sort of thing.
Okay. And where did you meet your wife?
I met my wife when I was in graduate school. She was attending the last 2 years of college in Boston, and we met through a mutual friend who was a fraternity brother of mine. And we dated for 6 weeks. She went back to Panama. I didn't see each other for 3.5 years. I flew down, we got engaged, and then I went to Germany, and she came over 7 months later, and we were married in Germany. And she said if we ever had any daughters who did that, she'd kill them. So we had all boys. I made that decision very simple for her. I think she was kidding.
Yeah. What do you remember about your wedding?
My what?
Your wedding?
Well, my wedding lasted 2 days. But I asked people, what's our anniversary? I said, well, February 7th and 8th. And the reason for that is in Germany, church weddings have no legal standing. And you have to be married in a state or government-sponsored marriage ceremony. Well, they only were available in the little town we were living in where the Army base was on Friday. So we got married on Friday. And then in that church, that was the official one. And then a priest friend of ours, who was an Anglican priest from Munich, came up and he married us in the church rites on the 8th. So we kid about the day. When people say, how many times have you been married? I say 2. And they, oh, you know, because I always assume that Carmen's my second wife. No, she's my first and second wife.
Do your families get together for a lot of family reunions?
Well, not anymore, because all of our parents are dead from our side. Our son, older son, lives in Wilmington, North Carolina with his family, where he's at the University of North Carolina, that campus there. And then the other one lives in Seattle. So we get together quite frequently during the course of the year. But we typically have in Denver maybe 1 or 2 family reunions a year where they all come together. In Lakewood and around. We have a home in the mountains too. We frequently go up there with them.
Were you born in or out of a hospital?
I was born in a hospital.
Okay. And delivered by a doctor?
I assume so, yes,
yeah.
Since there's a doctor's name on my birth certificate. I do have a birth certificate, and I'm proud to show it to people.
Did your family use home recipes or cures, or did you
Well,
go to
my
the
mother
doctor?
was a professional nurse, so she was very closely a good friend of the town. We grew up in a small farm town, as I mentioned, or I did, and we had the country doctor that you'd image. He had a house with a big porch, and everybody sat on the porch until he called them in. So there were no real home remedies. I mean, she was very much into the arts of the medical profession. With regard to during the war in particular and after, home canning. I remember her still canning, getting all the bottles and so on. As soon as Birdseye came out with frozen food, that whole thing disappeared. She bought a freezer.
Do you remember your first telephone?
Yes. Yeah. It was one on the wall, went, because in a rural community, you had a line with about 18 people on it. When the phone rang, everybody in town picked up the receivers and listened in. And then you go to the switchboard, which was in Sadie's living room in some town, and if she was out taking a rest break, that was the end of the phone service for a while. And then it eventually progressed till we got to rotary phones and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Do you remember the first vehicle that you had?
Yeah, I do, basically, because it was during the war, and it was a pickup truck, an old one, because you couldn't get any new vehicles during World War II. Mm-hmm. And we couldn't get a tractor either. We needed it on the farm, so my dad bought an old big 1.5-ton truck, cut it down, made it into a tractor, kept the cab and the engine in the back, and it got to be known as a doodle bug. And that was our tractor for 5 years. And then after the war was over, of course, we were able then to get car, new truck, and a real tractor.
Do you remember when you got your first computer?
Yes, and that would have been here in Lakewood, and that would have been probably around, let's see, that'd be about 82. I remember buying it. We got it up at a computer stop at the corner of Kipling and Jewel up there, and it was one of those old gray IBMs. Remember those? Mm-hmm. Had 256 kilobytes of memory and floppy disks and manuals hand typed by somebody who had English as their 47th language. I look back on that, and what killed me about that is the computer and the printer and the software that came with it cost me $8,000 in 1982. Imagine what that would be in today's money, about $25,000 to $30,000. Today, there's more computer technology in this cell phone than we had in that computer.
Times have changed.
Yes.
Did your parents always have electricity?
Yes.
Okay. And
Except during some thunderstorms, of course.
what kind of games did you play as a child?
Baseball, a lot of games of that type where you got together and just had fun with your friends. And then for a while when I was in high school, for some reason I developed a real interest in chess, so I played a lot of chess with some of my classmates. Okay.
And what kind of games did you play with your children?
Basically, the kids' games type thing, and then of course once they got into school and picked up into their sports activities, starting off with soccer and then went into lacrosse. I mean, that was their big passion. So most of our games then were mind games. Okay.
What were your favorite toys when you were a child?
Actually, an old Gilbert Erector set. You don't even see those anymore. The ones with the metal actually had real metal in them. And I had two great big ones my parents had gave me. And we moved from Boston after I left MIT and came out to Gates. Somebody in the moving company stole them all.
Oh. How did art?
Along with my fishing gear, I might add about that. Go ahead.
Oh, how sad.
It was dumb of me to leave it with them.
How did art and music affect your life?
Very much. My mother was very much into the arts, and of course in Cleveland when I was growing up was at that time a very prosperous community with a very strong arts community, and the Cleveland Symphony Orchestra was a favorite of hers, and George Sell, who was a world-renowned conductor, headed it. So we used to go a lot to symphony concerts, and then later in high school I got introduced to opera, and I've been a big fan of classical music and opera ever since. Like good jazz too, but it has to be really good jazz. And bluegrass as long as nobody sings. Okay.
What are your hobbies?
My major hobbies are fishing primarily right now and politics because I have to stay up on it when I work with my clients and all that sort of thing. And also I do writing. I publish a number of articles in various journals and this sort of thing.
Okay. And whereabouts have you traveled?
Well, I've been to about 30 different countries, and I've traveled I've been in all 50 states of the United States, so I've gotten around quite a bit. And a lot of that travel was both business, the fact that my wife is from Panama, and then we've been in South America and Central America. And then, of course, when I was in the Army, I spent almost 2.5 years in Germany, and we toured a great deal through the Middle East and the European countries, too.
So how did you become involved with the city of Lakewood?
Actually, in 1975, a woman named Betty Miller was one of our council members, and she was appointed to be the head of DOLA, the Department of Local Affairs, by Governor Lamb, and there was a vacancy. And I applied with a number of other people to fill that vacancy at the request of my wife. She said, you ought to do that. Much to my surprise, I got it. And I got very actively involved in politics, and she sometimes questions whether or not she should have encouraged me to do that.
What role would you say you played in the development of Lakewood?
Well, Lakewood was already well in the development process in terms of becoming a city that was fully operational. As you know, it was incorporated in '69. Mm-hmm. I would say the biggest contributions that I made during that time were bringing finality to certain numbers of things that had to be put in place, such as like the Kipling construction projects and all those. But later, I think my greatest contribution to Lakewood was chairing the City Charter Commission, where we got the city charter actually approved, which was in '82, '83.
Okay. And what position did you hold?
I was chair of that commission.
Okay. And who were some of your contemporaries and peers in the city?
Well, at that time, of course, Mayor Ritchie was still here, and then later followed by Charles Whitlock. Started out with Ray Wells being city manager, and then Chuck Anderson was his successor. And then, of course, on council, there were a number of people that I had because we had an 11-member council at that time. And then over the years, I've maintained close contact with a lot of the council members, in effect, and particularly the mayors of the city I've known quite well.
What memorable events took place while you worked for the city?
I would say the most memorable events that took place were probably the adoption of the charter. That was extremely critical. I think also Lakewood started to really develop in the '70s into being a premier city of accomplishment and having a first-class image. I think the most notable benefit that we see of that is just an example from our police department. we have what, 70 almost, or some number like that now, of chiefs of police and sheriffs and chief law enforcement officers that have come from our department. That recognizes the city as having a high level of a standard of excellence. And I think you mentioned Jim Ritchie before we started, our first mayor. I have to give him credit for that, because he had very high standards for the city. And those sets of standards have been maintained consistently by all of his successors and the professional staff of the city.
What were some of your favorite memories while you were here, working for the city?
Well, I would say just generally the council meetings, the camaraderie that existed on council. Yeah, we had our differences. Sometimes we'd have knockdown, drag-out fights. The next day we'd be out playing golf together or something. You know? And I think the other thing too was just to see Lakewood starting to really grow up, and the development that we were able to bring in. The fact that we had some really good economic success stories, and ones, of course, most recently, that we had the economic development that occurred before the 2008 crash and the sales tax increase. So the city of Lakewood has fared very well compared to our contemporary cities around us, who are struggling financially in many cases. Now, it doesn't mean we're not struggling, but we're not in stress.
And what do you want to be remembered in terms of your contributions to the city?
I was asked that one time, what would you like to have people say about your contribution to the city? And I thought about it, and I came back with a different answer. I said, I don't want anybody to ever say, if only he had. To me, you hear that all the time. You drive down streets and they'll say, well, only if they had. And I think the city of Lakewood, yeah, we have some of that we could have done differently, but overall, I think the city has done an outstanding job of good stewardship and leadership in the community. And I think the citizens of the community respect it. Yes, we've had our naysayers. There's still people out there that think we should never have incorporated. But most of those people now have gone on to other rewards. And the city, I think, is accepted and respected very highly by its citizens, as proof of the elections that we've had.
How did working for Lakewood influence your life?
Well, I think the biggest part of it was that when I was on city council, it dawned on me one time we had this incredibly professional staff, and many of whom have gone on to city manager positions and so on elsewhere in the country. And I'm sitting up there one day and I said, who's done anything to develop us? You know, the beauty of elected office in the United States, with the exception of some coroner's offices and some sheriff's offices where you have to be a professional officer, is that competency for service is not a requirement. And so and I won't get into current observations about that, but anyhow, and so I started to think about what can be done when people get elected to office. And as they say, they get sworn in to be sworn at, that what helps them understand what they're getting into. Because most people, all of a sudden, get elected to public office, particularly in the city here. Oh, you're in a major corporation with a highly professional staff, a lot of resources, and they've never managed those kind of operations. I mean, let's face it, most people don't even balance their own checkbooks. And so as a result, I started with a professor from CU, and we started developing the first training programs for public officials. And those were then later distributed to associations like the Colorado Municipal League and so on. And now if you go across the country, it's not our programs, but the concept of having educational programs for elected officials and certification programs and things whereby they can progress in their development of their skills and knowledge to be effective in elected office, those are now commonplace throughout the United States.
And so what did you do for work after the city? Did you start your company?
Then my company.
Right.
And I went back to actually starting to make some money. Because being on city council back in those days, because we had a lot of things going on, absorbed a lot of time. And a lot of people think, oh, you get elected to office, you serve maybe 2 hours a week. And I found that sometimes I was spending the entire 40 hours of the week. And if you take a look at our current mayor and our previous mayors, anybody who was mayor, they found out it was a full-time job just being the mayor of a city. That is not a strong mayor city, but the mayor has to be the ambassador to everything. Mm-hmm. And so as a result, that public relations aspect and the community relations and metro relations aspect becomes extremely important. But after that, I went back into my company and enjoyed working with all the companies, but always maintained contact with elected officials, because I'm still a firm believer, as Jefferson said, local communities are the bedrock of our democracy, and I really believe that. If local communities ever founder, the democracy's gone, because the federal government will just become a tyranny.
You kind of touched on this a little bit, but what was the best thing about working for the city?
The best thing, I just think the fact that I had the opportunity to do it. I mean, when I was one of something like 35 people who applied for that position, I thought my chances are somewhere between below nil and zero. And I got a call from Mayor Ritchie and said, you've been selected, and I couldn't believe it. And it opened up a whole new horizon for me, not only in terms of, but now a lot of my activity is as a result of having that exposure in the political arena.
And what was the worst thing about working for the city, if there is one?
I don't think there was really any worse thing. There were moments of frustration, like we had people fight us on things, and we had one effort where a person actually tried to recall a mayor, Mayor Reitler. He did make the comment that if he did not succeed in having Mayor Reitler called, he would leave the community. He was a man of his word. And so as a result, I don't have any really negative experiences or memories about the city. I just had some moments of frustration. And I got tired of hearing people come up, the anti-group who didn't want the city formed, always had some reason to see the negative aspects of what was going on in the cities. The mayor was a developer, this, that, city manager, this. They had all kinds of litanies of things they dragged out. But that's attenuated. We don't hear that anymore. It's pretty much, you hear an occasional burst of it, but it's pretty much gotten that. The immaturity of that is out of our political system.
Gotcha.
Now it's at the federal level.
And talking now about your semi-retirement, what have you done of interest since you've been semi-retired?
Well, I still work very closely with associations like the Florida Association of Counties, Minnesota, a lot of leagues yet. I'm going to be at the end of this week at NACO conference doing 2 workshops for the National Association of Counties. It's at their Pittsburgh annual conference. So that's where I focus most of my energy now, is with those. But and secondly, most of the clients with whom I work now are ones I've had a long-standing relationship, because I've got other things I want to do with my wife, and I want to travel more. So as a result, I'm cutting that back. I would say I probably spend about half of my time professionally.
Okay.
And I probably will keep on to it, because otherwise I'll just sit around and watch soap operas, and they're all horrible. Okay.
You mentioned one of your grandkids doing sports. How many grandkids do you have?
We have now 6 grandchildren and 2 step-grandchildren, so we say we have 8 grandchildren. And the oldest ones, they range now from about 4 months to 14 years. And the older ones, particularly the boys, are active in sports. But it's the usual things you think about now: soccer, then lacrosse, this sort of thing.
Sure. What do you like best about life now?
I think basically, one, good health, a happy marriage. Well, we have our moments, but happy marriage. And I just think the fact that I still have the opportunity to work, and I enjoy what I'm doing, and I keep intellectually active. And as long as the brain keeps going, hopefully the body will follow. Mm-hmm.
And what do you like best about Lakewood?
What I like about Lakewood, I think, one, is that it's a community in which I have tremendous pride. Secondly, it's a well-led and well-managed community. Recently, we did a series of programs right here in the studio where former mayors were here and so on. And one of the things that Linda Shaw brought up when we were at that conference, and I don't know why I was a part of it, because I was not part of the former mayors group, but they brought me in anyway. She said, of all of the mayors we've had, and I think now Bob Murphy is our 7th mayor, if I remember correctly, is that there's never been any acrimony amongst these mayors, both in the election process or the relationships afterward. And they all still get together, they maintain close friendships. That kind of sense of that interactivity and personal relationships is what community is all about. And I think I like that. And another thing too is that Lakewood has maintained high standards of service. You go through the community, it's clean, it's neat, everything is pretty well preserved and maintained. It's a community in which you can have real pride. And I'm glad to be a part of it, and have been a part of it.
And if you would describe any old signs or buildings that are still near where you lived or where you worked.
Well, right down, the oldest building right next to me is probably right at the corner of Wadsworth and Yale, which is Avoca, which was the Molly Brown summer home. The rest of the buildings down there that had any historical significance are pretty much gone because they were basically farmsteads. Now, over in Bear Creek Park, we have the Hudson Stone House, this sort of thing, which was reconstructed. But as you go through Lakewood right now, with the exception of a few things like the diner up on Colfax Avenue with the horse on top, and now the buildings they bought and preserved and brought over to the historical site at Belmar, a lot of those old buildings are gone, and the ones that are left on Colfax, I think many of those are going to succumb to urban development. And quite frankly, I think that may not be all bad. Some of them have no significance other than eyesore.
Right.
Now, that's a personal opinion. Others may disagree with me.
Sure. And the Jefferson County Public Library and the Historical Society were wondering if you had any old photos of the area that you might want to share.
Well, I
with
really
them.
don't, because we got here in '69.
Okay.
So I don't have any old photos. I do have, and I've got to dig it out of my safe deposit box. I was thinking about it the other day. I mentioned when we moved here, it was still Jefferson City, Colorado. And I have a charge card with Denver Dry, another institution that's gone, that has on it Jefferson City, Colorado. And I was going to give them the charge card as a historical snapshot of a very short period in Lakewood's history, with a few months that we were actually Jefferson City, Colorado.
So is it okay if they get a hold of you to
Sure.
do that?
They can give me a call and I'll go dig it out of the safe deposit box. I know it's around somewhere.
Okay.
The question is where. My wife has an expression, everything's someplace. I say, honey, that's true, but the key is to find the someplace. Okay.
My last question is for people who listen to this interview or maybe watch this interview years in the future, what advice would you give to those people who are listening to this?
I would say, particularly with regard to the city of Lakewood, the state of Colorado, and it could even go to the national, pay a lot more attention to how your communities work and get involved in it. It doesn't mean you have to be actively involved, like being on city council or some of the boards and commissions and so on. But it just appalls me when you look at the surveys of the ignorance of the American public towards how their government works. There was a survey that just came out, I think, from Pew Research now that said 51% it was 65% maybe, these numbers are off. Can't even name one senator from the state. 51% can't name both of them. Okay, it's the other way around. Can't name both and then can't name one. But if you're going to have a successful community and a successful state and even a successful nation, we have a big taboo about don't talk politics when you go anywhere. Well, if you don't talk politics, you shut down a conversation about the very fabric of society. What do you think would have happened if our founders, when they started talking about maybe we ought to get rid of King George, don't talk politics? But no, they signed a document that said we pledge our life, liberty, and personal happiness. How many people today would pledge the fact that they may wind up being drawn and quartered, lose all their estates, and die in prison if they weren't drawn and quartered? You know, they took an ultimate sacrifice. And I'm not asking people to make that sacrifice, but I do think they have a responsibility for civic awareness. My wife makes comments regularly. Her little country of Panama is about 5 million people. When you go down there, those people are more knowledgeable about what's going on in the world than most people I meet in the United States. We literally live in a vacuum of ignorance about government and international affairs. Again, personal opinion. And I would ask the youth not to continue to have that be a part of their life. There's something in the world besides the Denver Broncos. Okay, that they need to pay attention to. The Broncos aren't going to save our nation. Okay.